This is Dan Roos with EQ, and I'm here talking with Alex Miller. Alex Miller is in a lot of different spaces. He is a big player in the open source developer community that is about Clojure, and we're going to talk a little bit about that and how that gets used. But he's also the founder of Strange Loop, one of the largest developer conferences out there, especially from an independent perspective, that launched in St. Louis starting from a movie theater and has grown to be a very large conference that he runs as a very successful business. But, we're going to talk about what it takes to keep developers happy and engaged and productive. Alex, thanks for joining us today.
Hello.
Tell our listeners and readers what Clojure is and how that works as a community for your day gig.
Sure. So Clojure is a general purpose programming language. It's really used for everything these days. Probably most commonly it's used for a lot of fintech type stuff, e-commerce, making websites, same kind of stuff as everybody else is using. And the big sort of main thing about Clojure is that it really centers data and information. That's kind of the focus of what it tries to make easy to work with and easy to transform and manipulate. And so almost everything is really centered around how do we do that? And that applies to everything. So it's a broadly applicable language. And I picked it up about 10 years ago now for a startup that I was working with, and I was the main architect for a product there, and evaluated several different languages and ended up deciding, well, the team really decided we were actually trying a few different things, and a couple months in, we found that everybody was only working on the Clojure stuff. So the team kind of collectively decided that that was the language they wanted to use, and it was not what I was expecting, but I was really happy with it. And then after I've been doing that for a few years, I got to know the language creators and some of the team around it and was really excited by it and sort of proposed to them that maybe I could work on the language itself and work as sort of a community steward relationship type of person. And that ended up working out.
What is it like to steward versus working on an end product?
Yeah, it's different. I mean, I've worked on big company service, internal service type stuff. I've worked on startup tech products, and I've worked on open source, both in terms of Clojure, and I used to work at a company called Terracotta that had a open core commercial services kind of a model. So I've worked in all those different domains. Doing software is doing software, So that aspect of it is actually pretty similar. In all cases, you're trying to look at your user, figure out what problems they're having and how you can help them out and what things you can change in the software. There's a little bit difference in if you're inside a company, you have stakeholders that it wants you to build a thing, right? Or to satisfy a market need or whatever it is, When you're building an open source general purpose language, it's somewhat up to you to figure that out. And you have to figure that out by sort of looking at what people are doing and how they're using the language and where they're struggling with the language and that sort of thing. So the process is the same. The big difference is that it's open world. So you're just trying to funnel a whole bunch of inputs.
I know those inputs really helpful. Like, I would imagine it's way easier in an organization to have a product owner. It's just like, well, we disagree with that approach, but the product owner says that's the need, so we're running with that.
So the way that people typically talk about problems is by saying, I want this solution. And so you really have to fight over and over again to say, okay, well, that's a thing that you can envision. What is the real problem you're having? And working back to that. And we spend 80% of our time trying to do that, like how can we really understand the actual problem people are having? And it's hard. That to me is the meat of it and the interesting part of the work.
So along the lines of what Henry Ford, used to say, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster or stronger horses.
Exactly. That's exactly right. They have a thing now. They can envision a way you could twist it a little bit and it would do something that they would use. But maybe their real problem is that you could give them a different thing that would work better. And so the other sort of aspect with building a programming language is that we're fanatically interested in not breaking things. So, there's, tens of thousands of Clojure users in the world and products and things built on it. And so your first job is when I add something new, don't break an old thing. That's incredibly important. And sometimes that means you bake in an existing thing that's not exactly what you want, and you just live with that. And maybe instead of fixing thing one, you make a thing two, but then the other even trickier thing is, how do I add a thing in a way that will not prevent me from adding some other thing that doesn't exist yet in the future? So it's figuring out not just backwards compatibility, but future compatibility. And that's an art form. It takes a lot of practice, and, we don't always get it right, but I think we're pretty good at it.
So when you and I talked before this call today, we talked about Nubank as a specific example. So earlier on you talked about, well, Clojure might be used in fintech, but there's a lot of fintech that's very legacy systems, very COBOL oriented. But Nubank is an example of kind of one of these new digital banks, and maybe thinking differently about how they solve their problems rather than the old legacy systems. So is that part of it also, that you're building a language for people that think differently about a problem?
I mean, I would really say no. Clojure is ultimately trying to do something that is simple, in that it's trying to make information easy to represent, easy to transform, and easy to evolve over time. And it doesn't matter how you were doing it before or how you're going to do it. It's all the same problem. It's how do we represent this thing in the world in data that I'm storing in a computer over time. I mean, Rich Hickey is the creator of Clojure and still works on it. And I think one of the differentiators in Clojure is how much he thinks about the importance of time with designing and developing software. And he has a lot of experience building information systems that ran for a long time. One of the several big projects that he worked on is the exit poll election system that is used partially to predict, presidential elections and things like that. And so it's a system that just sits and runs for a long period of time doing stuff. He worked on software for radio stations, stuff where you're just building a programming playlist for radio stations, and there's all sorts of special cases that come up, and regulatory requirements change, and music changes, and genres change, and stuff changes over time, right? So it's how can we build a system that actually anticipates that you're always going to need to change your software, and design language features that at least don't, make that hard, and ideally make it easy. Clojure is designed around a very small set of core data structures and a broad set of transformations that can occur on those data structures. And every Clojure program fits the pattern of, how do I represent my domain in that small set of data structures? And at that point, you have access to all the transformations that you normally do on any kind of Clojure data. Clojure is actually built in the Lisp dialect, and Lisp is the oldest programming language. And one of the key differentiators there is that Clojure code is itself represented in those data structures. So once you do that, you can then use Clojure to manipulate Clojure code.
Wow, that's very meta. That's very meta.
It is, and you can do all sorts of interesting, what they call meta programming in Clojure.
We also wanted to talk about Strange Loop. I knew back when you started Strange Loop, and you were like, there's a need for a different kind of conference that scratches this itch that I have in my day-to-day work. Can you talk a little bit about what you envisioned Strange Loop to be, how people were supporting developers weren't yet doing?
Yeah, I mean, it really sort of has its origins back in the sort of 2008-ish time frame. And there's a point in the technology landscape where all of a sudden the things that people have been doing for many years were starting to people were willing to look at alternatives. And so people have been using Java forever, but it was not really, enterprise Java was not really meeting enterprise companies' needs. It was just too expensive to make and maintain. At that moment, there was kind of an explosion of programming languages, and people were interested in actually exploring them and using them to do real work. And so there's a bunch of languages that came out then. Clojure is one of them. Similarly, people had been using SQL databases forever, but suddenly, for just market reasons, people were interested in looking at other things. Things that were where you store data in the cloud, or you use different kinds of graph models instead, because we're doing all these sort of socially connected graph type data things all of a sudden, which are really bad in SQL databases. So before Strange Loop, there was a local developer group called Lambda Lounge that I started. It was about 6 months before I decided to do Strange Loop. And it was kind of a test bed for that. And I knew people, all these individual little user groups all over that were exploring these different languages and databases and stuff like that. And some of them were like 5 people and 10 people, that kind of thing. And I said to all those groups, like, hey, what if we just had like a sort of a bigger tent thing that's talking about functional and dynamic languages and NoSQL databases and new tech, involving tech and bleeding edge kind of stuff. And the very first meeting of it, I think there were over 100 people at the first meeting. So I did a very good job of connecting all those people together, and there absolutely was an audience for that kind of thing. And then so once I had success with that, I had started thinking about maybe doing a conference or something, and I thought I can surely get 150 local people together to have a one-day conference. That was the initial dream, you know. But it kind of blew up. So the first conference I ended up expanding it to a day and a half, and we had 300 people. Then it just kind of exploded from there. It was kind of doubling for a while.
So how do you keep it this big tent or more generalist, but still make it be topical enough to draw people to it?
We try to combine both people who are sort of industry leading people, so people who are working with these new languages, databases, building, massively scaled services. And then we also try to bleed in a certain amount of research. So I always invite some, computer science professors and people who are working on theory and that kind of thing. Those two groups don't talk to each other, like to a large degree. So actually just bringing those two worlds together in a way where they can bump into each other and feed off of each other is something that was always a goal, and I think has actually happened in practice. And it's kind of gotten different years. It kind of shifts back and forth a little bit, but it's meant to be useful for the working programmer, but also, feed in what are people actually trying to research right now. These people live in different worlds. The people who are building Twitter, they're working their butts off to maintain a service. They've got problems to solve and users and growth curves and all that kind of stuff. And then there's academics who are sitting and they go talk to other academics, and they go to academic conferences, and they don't go to industry conferences. And I'm generalizing. There are definitely people that do in both cases. But in general, they are sort of just different worlds that don't collide that much. So I think it's interesting to jam those things together.
Yeah.
The other aspect of it that I really was there at the beginning, but was not explicit in my mind, but has become explicit, is the sort of notion of how does programming affect the world? Like, how do we bump up against the humanities and digital privacy and rights and tech being used for different things like that? How is it used in art? Like, I think if I made a whole conference about that, it would get less exposure. But I think if I can bring in 10, 20% content that's in that area, it has the opportunity to really inspire and expand people's idea about what programming is and what it can do. I think that's the kind of thing where the company is not going to send a programmer from their company to go see a conference all about that. But if you got 10% of that content, they can go catch some of it and be inspired and be, have their mind expanded a little bit. So I try to get that in there too.
Is that something that you have to have a team? And how do you jointly curate something like that and get to what is the actual slate of a conference each year?
I am a firm believer in both active curation and open inputs. I always invite people to the conference. It's a way for me to put my thumb on the scale a little bit in terms of topics and diversity of speakers, interesting personalities, people that have things to say. I think there's also things every year that come in the open call that I never would have known anything about, but are amazing. Really, the mix of the two is where you get the interesting stuff. I've experimented with different things over the years, so it's not been totally uniform. Last year, I paid a stipend to every speaker. Speakers also get free hotel and travel. Whether or not to actually pay people an explicit stipend is kind of an interesting thing. Can you pay enough for it to actually be meaningful or to feel insulting? So it's all just a bit of a game in terms of the budget. I firmly believe that people doing doing work should get compensated.
So what are some examples of some sessions that were really just memorable to you over the years?
One of the things that I find the most rewarding is to go out and find people who haven't actually done a lot of speaking that have something really interesting to say, like especially for keynotes. And it's really hard. It requires a lot of time. And I spend a lot of time watching Twitter, watching YouTube videos, going through, GitHub projects or whatever to find people who are doing interesting things. And occasionally that just pays off phenomenally. One that I would say that comes to mind is Idalyn Bobet, who did a keynote talk the year after Michael Brown was killed. She had a very unique perspective, and she had actually been using a different name for a long time to hide because she didn't feel comfortable using her actual first name. And so she changed her whole Twitter persona to some degree after that talk. I mean, it was really impactful. Probably one of the most fun talks that I ever did was interviewing Adam Savage, from the guy from Mythbusters and lots of other stuff. He gave about a half-hour talk, and I interviewed him for about a half hour on stage. And that was fantastic. He's someone that I always enjoy watching. He's a natural communicator and a maker of lots of different things, and he really connected with the audience, and it was a fantastic talk, which unfortunately was not recorded.
Oh, bummer. If I remember right, you've tried to do some more participatory or not just lecture kinds of things. What works as an experience for this audience?
I'm always looking for new ways to have things at the conference that are not a face front speaker kind of a thing. Unfortunately, that's the thing that scales. And there are very few other things that scale like a front first speaker talk. But we do have smaller workshops that occur as a sort of a pre-conference day. And those are an opportunity for you to sit with 20 other people and do something. And those are often more participatory. We've had a number of different audio related things like making music with different kinds of programming technology, interactive fiction writing things. We've had zine writing workshops. We've had taught people Go, the game. So we've had all sorts of different stuff. We've been doing the party at City Museum for a long time. And so we just run the whole City Museum and fill it full of a bunch of developers, basically.
And what do they think when they see the City Museum? We have this City Museum here in St. Louis. It's an amazing thing. So tell me about what it's like to turn developers loose in the City Museum.
It's mind-blowing. It's so awesome seeing it. Like, it's one of those things, like, I've been there 100 times, and so I'm used to it to some degree. It's always great to go, right? But you get to see it through other people's eyes, like, all night long. It's, they're just walking around with their mouths open, they just don't even understand what to think about it. Because it's not one thing. It's like many things over, laid over the top of each other. And I really think of the City Museum as being kind of fractal. Like, you can look at it like in this big, like you can stand away from the building and look at it and you're like, what the heck, And then you can get into a particular area and enjoy an area. And then you can go just look at the wall and like, oh, those are actually bedpans that were recovered from a local hospital or whatever. Or those are, there's just like these tiny little details that most people don't even notice.
2020 has been a year where you had to postpone doing an in-person conference, but can you continue to, seek those people out and find people? Is that possible to do when you take a break, or is that harder to do when you don't have a conference?
I can't stop doing it. So I literally do it all the time. I do it every day.
Yeah.
It is at this point a habit that I have had for a decade. So I'm literally always on the lookout for those kinds of things. I have different files and places where I keep those kinds of things, and a lot of times if I don't have time to deal with it, I'll just send myself an email. So I've got an inbox full of emails from myself right now to look at when I start like really getting serious about that stuff.
This has been a great conversation. I want to close with one thing, like, as we think about the idea of a community like Clojure or, the day work that you do, because you don't just do Strange Loop as your job, what can we do to, to think about how do we support those communities that you're trying to support?
Developers want to do their best work. They want to do work that is interesting and challenging and that pushes them a little bit, but not so far that they don't know what they're doing, And you want to be learning things and So I think anything you can do to create structures that help them do that, and also structures that help you, it's really easy to get into that grind, where you're doing the same thing and even if you're working productively, you're doing the same thing every day. To have an opportunity to say, I'm not going to do that for a day or 2 days or a week or something like that. And I'm going to allow myself to be creative about what I'm thinking about, what I'm doing, and take a little bit of inspiration from the arts and what would be a fun thing to work on, and what would be an inspiring thing for me to create that somebody else would get use out of, that kind of thing. And maybe it's not what you're building every day, but it's still useful.
Things like the City Museum that are kind of inspiring or ways to challenge and everything. Can you think of other examples around the world or in other, even online spaces or whatever that are good examples of how to do that kind of stretching of yourself?
I come back to the arts. We've had a couple keynote talks on this at Strange Loop even. I'm really inspired by like the Apollo missions and Cassini missions, or things when we've really stepped outside and tried to explore our universe. I think that if you look at any kind of art, and really try to get something out of it, I think that you can be inspired to find relationships to your own work, even if it doesn't seem obvious at first.
Well, thanks so much, Alex. This has been a great talk. Make sure you check out Strange Loop, and if you're a developer, check out the work that Alex does.